20. That's the percentage of the world's daily oil supply that moved through a single waterway, a strip of ocean, 33 miles wide at its narrowest point. As of March 2026, that strip of ocean is, for practical purposes, closed. And here is what I've found after studying the data, the shipping records, and the institutional analyses from bodies like the U.S. Congressional Research Service, the Atlas Institute for International Affairs, and the Stimson Center. The way this story is being told in the news is not the whole story. The headlines will tell you about missiles and drones. They'll tell you about the price of oil crossing $100. They'll tell you which side fired what and when. What they are not telling you is the mechanism. And the mechanism is what changes your life. Stay with me for the next 12 minutes, because by the time
we're done, you're going to understand something that most people watching the news every day still don't.
I've spent years studying how economic systems fail. Not the dramatic collapses you read about in history books, but the slow, structural unraveling that happens when a single assumption turns out to be wrong. The assumption the global economy built itself on for decades was this: the Strait of Hormuz would always be open. Not because anyone guaranteed it, not because there was a law that made it inviolable, but because the cost of closing it was assumed to be so catastrophic for everyone that no rational actor would ever do it. That assumption, as of February 28, 2026, is no longer operative. And here is why that matters more than any missile count you'll see on the news tonight. Let me show you the map as it actually is, not as it's usually presented. The Strait of Hormuz is a passage roughly 21 nautical miles wide at its navigable channel. On one side, Iran. On the other, the Musandam Peninsula, shared between Oman and the UAE.
According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in 2024, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products moved through this passage every single day. That is roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. More than 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade on the planet, passing through a channel you could drive across in 20 minutes. Now think about that for a moment. Curious. The global economy, the price of everything from the gasoline in your car to the plastic in your phone to the fertilizer that grew the food on your table, runs through something the size of a municipal commute. That's not a metaphor. That's the structural reality that nobody put in the headline, and here is where the map starts to lie. When you watch the coverage of this conflict, the story is framed as a military confrontation. Strikes, counterstrikes, air defenses, missile trajectories, size. That frame is not wrong. But it is incomplete in a way that costs you money and may cost you a great deal more than that. Curious, because the real disruption, the one that is already moving through your economy right now, did not require a naval blockade. It did not require mines in the water or warships on patrol. According to analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in the weeks before the conflict, the strait was averaging more than 153 vessel transits per day. Since March 1st, according to ship tracking data, only 78 vessels were detected passing through the strait over an 11-day period, a daily average of 13, from 153 to 13. Helima Croft, the global head of commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, described it precisely. All Iran had to do was conduct several drone strikes in the vicinity of the strait, and suddenly insurers and shipping companies decided it was unsafe to traverse that very narrow S-curve of water. Size. That's the mechanism nobody is explaining on the evening news. The weapon wasn't the missile. The weapon was the insurance certificate. S-curve of water. That's the mechanism nobody is explaining on the evening news. Curious. The weapon wasn't the missile. The weapon was the insurance certificate. Let me explain what that means. A tanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is not just a ship. It is a financial instrument. It moves only when a chain of contracts is intact. Ownership, charter, cargo insurance, war risk coverage, crew agreements, port clearance. When war risk insurance for the strait was removed on March 5th, not raised, removed, the economic calculus changed for every single ship operator on Earth simultaneously. According to data reviewed by the Stimson Center, war risk premiums for tankers had already climbed from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of ship insurance value per transit. For a very large crude carrier, that's an increase of $250,000 per crossing, and then coverage became unavailable at any price. Surprised Iraq, which has no pipeline alternative to the strait, began shutting down production in some of its largest oil fields, not because of bombs, because with nowhere to export, there is nowhere to put the oil. Kuwait, Qatar, a substantial share of Saudi Arabian and UAE exports, all physically dependent on a waterway that has effectively ceased to function. According to the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, even in the most optimistic scenario, 2/3 of current Gulf crude exports remain physically dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. The bypass pipelines, Saudi Arabia's east-west line, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, together handle roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. The strait normally carries 20. The math does not work. And here is what this now means for prices. Oil was trading at roughly $70 per barrel before the conflict began. By March 8th, Brent crude had crossed $100 for the first time in 4 years. It peaked briefly near 120. As of mid-March, it is trading above 103. Analysts at Al Jazeera's Center for Studies have estimated that without a medium-term crisis management solution, prices could reach 120 per barrel, and in a prolonged scenario potentially approach 200. But wait. Surprised. Because this is where the story gets more complicated. The United States released 172 million barrels from its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the International Energy Agency, in what was described as the largest emergency reserve release in its history. Authorized 400 million barrels from member nations' reserves. 400 million barrels. Exhale sharply. Sounds enormous, does not it? According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, global consumption of petroleum runs at approximately 105 million barrels per day. The 400 million barrel release covers less than 4 days of global consumption. Even measured only against the strait's normal daily flow of 20 million barrels, it covers 20 days, after which the fundamental problem remains exactly where it was. An Al Jazeera economic analyst summarized it. The release may soften the shock and calm nerves temporarily, but it will remain limited as long as the fundamental problem, freedom of supply and tanker movement through Hormuz, remains unresolved. Surprised. Now here is the piece of the story that changes the entire geopolitical picture. You might assume that the United States and its Western allies are bearing the brunt of this energy shock. The data shows something different. According to the U.S. EIA, 84% of the crude oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 was destined for Asian markets. Not Europe, not the United States. Curious. Asia. According to analysis from the Atlas Institute for International Affairs, China, India, Japan, and South Korea together accounted for 69% of all Hormuz crude flows. Japan depends on imported fossil fuels for 87% of its total energy use, while 95% of its crude oil imports originate from the Middle East. South Korea channels approximately 68% of its crude imports through the strait. Korea's LNG reserves? Roughly 3.5 million tons, enough for 2 to 4 weeks of stable demand. Japan's reserves? 4.4 million tons, the same window. And here is the dimension that almost no mainstream outlet is covering. Curious. The strait doesn't only carry oil and gas. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz. Nitrogen exports, urea. The price of urea at the New Orleans fertilizer hub has already risen from $475 per metric ton to $680. This is happening during the spring planting season for soy and corn in the American Midwest. According to CNBC analysis, 45% of global sulfur exports transit the strait, aluminum from the UAE, petrochemicals for Asia's garment industry, helium for semiconductor manufacturing. Surprised? This is not an oil story. This is a supply chain story, and it will show up in the price of your groceries, your clothes, and your electronics before most people understand why. I want to be precise about something here. None of this is speculation. What I've described is the mechanism documented by institutions ranging from the Congressional Research Service to Chatham House to the Stimson Center. The question is not whether these effects are real. They are already in motion. Curious. The question that should concern you, and the one the headlines are not asking, is this: how long does this last? Because a disruption measured in weeks produces a price spike. A disruption measured in months produces something structural. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies has estimated that a one-year closure would result in a 15% decline in global LNG supply relative to 2024 levels. A shortfall that no amount of demand-side adjustment could fully absorb in the short term. Chatham House analysts have modeled scenarios where sustained disruption pushes oil to $130 per barrel before any second-half decline. In an escalation scenario, that number moves higher. And Bank of America analysts have warned that the broader risk is not simply inflation, but what they describe as a synchronized global economic slowdown driven by sustained disruption. Size: stagflation, not recession, stagflation, rising prices and slowing growth simultaneously. The worst combination for anyone trying to protect their savings, their pension, or their purchasing power. I've spent time studying the crises that reshaped the post-W order. The 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months. It produced a recession, a decade of stagflation, and a permanent restructuring of how Western economies thought about energy. It gave birth to the petrodollar system. It accelerated nuclear energy in France. It changed the political map of the United States. Surprised? From 5 months of disruption to a waterway that carried far less than the Strait of Hormuz carries today. The 2026 closure has already been described by multiple analysts as the largest disruption to the global energy supply since the 1970s. We are, by the assessment of institutions like the Atlas Institute for International Affairs, watching a structural stress test of the post-1945 liberal economic order. Not a crisis that will be resolved and forgotten. Point. Pause. Whether we are on one side of that hinge or the other will depend on decisions being made in the next weeks and months, in Washington, Tehran, Beijing, Tokyo, and Riyadh. What you can do, right now, today, is understand the mechanism. Because understanding the mechanism is the only thing that separates informed decision-making from panic. Let me recap what we've covered. A waterway 33 miles wide at its navigable channel carries 20% of the world's daily oil supply, 20% of global LNG, a third of global fertilizer trade, and critical industrial inputs ranging from helium to sulfur. Serious Iran did not need a naval blockade to bring that traffic to a near-complete halt. It needed drone strikes and the withdrawal of war risk insurance. The emergency reserve releases authorized by the IEA cover less than 4 days of global consumption. The bypass pipelines cover roughly 3.5 million barrels per day against a normal flow of 20 million. 84% of Hormuz crude flows to Asia. The countries with the most to lose, Japan, South Korea, India, have weeks, not months, of reserve cover. Concerned. The effects on fertilizer prices, food inflation, and industrial supply chains are already visible and moving through the global economy on a 2 to 5 week lag. And analysts from Chatham House to Bank of America are warning that a prolonged disruption produces not just a price spike, but structural economic damage of the kind the world hasn't seen since the 1970s. Concerned. The map we were given told us the world's energy supply was secure, thoughtful, distributed, resilient, protected by deterrence and self-interest. The map was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. And now we are learning, in real time, what the map left out. Stay informed, not alarmed, informed, reassuring. Because there is a significant difference between the two, and the difference is understanding. I want to leave you with a question I've been sitting with. Thoughtful. The Strait of Hormuz has been identified as the world's most critical energy choke point in academic literature, government reports, and strategic planning documents for decades. Multiple institutions, from university research centers to intelligence agencies to international energy bodies, published warnings about exactly this scenario. Curious. So here is the question I'd like you to think about and share in the comments. If this risk was documented and known for decades, what does it tell us about the gap between what institutions understand and what they communicate to the public?